Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic, Writers in Their Own Words, the show where every episode I talk to writers about their work, the writing process, and, often as not, the publishing industry. The show is available by the same name on both YouTube and via all of the major podcast platforms. And you can subscribe to either or both, which is always my preference, so you never miss a thing. My regular open mic audience knows that over the years, most of the writers who appeared here have been mystery or thriller or crime fiction writers. Though every now and then I've also busted out. I've had some nonfiction authors, folks who do memoir, biographies, had a few fellow journalists like myself. And I've even had a playwright and the occasional songwriter. But today will be the very first time I have ever been joined by a poet. And not just any poet, but the truly wonderful and talented LJ Sysko, who joins me today from her home in Delaware. LJ, it has been such a long time. How are you doing? Welcome to the Open Mic.
It has been a long time. I'm so happy to be here, Rich. I
Um,
remember we met in San Diego, right, at a children's writing conference. And I forget what year that was. Who knows?
well, it was actually the San Diego State University Writers Conference, and I think the conference wasn't on children's writing, but it was a panel on that. And actually, that was going to be my lead. I really wanted to talk about this because um, I've had these strange experiences, which I think probably almost everybody's had, because I remember distinctly the moment that we met. You were already sitting, if I think I have this right, you were already sitting, and I walked in, there weren't a lot of other places, and we made eye contact, and you basically like motioned that I could sit next to you. And it was one of those moments in time where you feel like, do I know this person? And I realized right away I didn't, but it is one of those things that happens in life where you meet somebody and you feel like you've known them for a very long time. And it has worked out. All these, you live on the East Coast, I live on the West Coast, but you've allowed me to stay in your home before when I was working on the East Coast. And
Right?
great family and your children, your husband, and so it is weird sometimes how the world works. But it seemed like we were maybe predestined to meet somehow. So it is really wonderful to actually be speaking to you again live. To some extent, I guess if Zoom is considered
Right.
live interaction in this day and age. But yeah, thank you for coming on the show and being here today to talk about your fabulous new book, which I'm going to hold up for everybody to see, The Daughter of Man by LJ Sysko. And if you follow me on social media, you may have seen me talking about this book a few times and prefacing it with the caveat that with the exception probably of song lyrics, I know almost nothing about poetry. I am hardly an expert when it comes to poetry, but I'm a pretty good judge of good writing, and I will just tell you this is really excellent, and I'm really thrilled to have been able to read it and to have you on the show today. So thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much. You're right. That was not a children's writing conference. I was there for children's writing, having
Yes.
written a middle grade novel. I consider those my prose years now. A little interstitial period in between poeming. And yeah, you popped up right at that moment. You can always tell a kindred spirit at a workshop, especially if you schlep really far to get to a workshop by yourself. And you're just kind of like facing down the prospect of a couple of days at in a couple of 100-person rooms.
Yeah.
So when you see somebody who looks like a person who might be a great chat, it's so nice. And you really have been. Thank you so much for the compliment too about the book.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and last thing about that conference too, the San Diego State University Writers Conference was great. It went on for had about a 35-year run. It is now defunct. But I will say, and I love San Diego. I'm going to BoucherCon in San Diego in September. Love it. Love the city. Many, many friends there. But you do have to be aware when you go to San Diego, it's a military town, a lot of Marines, a lot of Navy personnel there, lot of ex-military. It's a great city to live in, so a lot of retired military there. So it is a conference that tends to draw, a lot of folks who write military thrillers and things like that. And so
Yeah,
I
I
think
didn't think of that.
that was one of our immediate bonding things is, we both felt, I think, a little bit like, ducks out of water to some extent, because, a lot of the folks there, this is how long ago it was. Barack Obama was still president. Because we had a little bit of a running joke. There were a couple of ladies there who were writing thrillers basically about how the president was a foreign agent and all of this stuff. And
Oh my
I don't know
gosh.
if you remember that. We
No, I've fortunately pruned that from my memory.
I'm not proud of it. We were a little snarky, but that was good. We found a little simpatico there too.
Well,
It's like,
snark comes with the territory. I
God.
do remember one other weird thing that happened at that. I met Megan Rapinoe, the soccer player,
Oh God,
in the
really?
lobby of that hotel and took a picture with her, which was really fun.
I didn't know that. I never heard that story. What was
Yeah.
she doing there?
She was injured at the time, I remember. And I asked her, "What are you doing here?" And she was saying that she had a meeting about broadcasting. So in my mind, I thought, oh, she's sort of hanging up her cleats and that's going to be it. And then, of course, she ended up having a few more great years left in her career. But I recognized her immediately.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was fun.
She's from not that far from where I'm at in Northern California, just a couple hours away up north. So yeah, wow, I didn't know that. It's an interesting story. Well, let's talk about your book, because, and I'm going to hold it up again for the folks on YouTube.
Yeah,
So
let's do it. We'll have
yeah,
it in surround sound.
there you go. Perfect. I've really enjoyed it. And one of the best description, maybe, this was not mine. This was one I read online, but it's been described as poetry for people who think they hate poetry, or at least find it unapproachable.
Right.
Which I thought is, I certainly don't hate poetry, nor do I find it unapproachable. But like I say, I'm not very knowledgeable of it. But for those who are not familiar with the book itself, can you please tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So when we hold up the cover, what we are looking at is a female figure with a bubblegum bubble partially obscuring her face, but mostly just rendering her mute. And I should explain that the title, The Daughter of Man, is derived from Rene Magritte's famous painting, The Son of Man, which is the one of the guy in the suit with the bowler hat and the green apple obscuring his face. People may remember that largely from the film The Thomas Crown Affair. Yeah. So thinking about that's actually a self-portrait of Magritte, and what he was striving to do there is basically criticize society, socio-political, economic forces in the way that they render identity monolithic. Particularly masculine identity becomes homogenous in a sort of post-industrial world, such that the guy's in a suit, it's like a basic costume, and we don't really need to see his face. He's just every man, and there's a million like him. So what I thought to do was harness that particular theme and then advance it with a feminist retort to say, well, if that's true of masculinity in this society, what happens to the feminine when you layer on the oppressive force of patriarchy? And so my thought was, instead of the son of man, then we would have the daughter, and think about her as a character, a kind of allegorical, archetypal daughter, moving through her own development from young girlhood all the way through until she becomes an old woman. And kind of what happens, what does that look like through that developmental process? I'm also kind of rendering it pop by placing her starting in the 1980s in suburbia. And so a lot of the stuff of the poems is kind of material pop cultural stuff that anyone who grew up through the 80s and 90s would recognize. And so part of what I'm attempting to do is make a kind of serious thematic statement akin to Magritte's, but also to have some fun with it, to send it up in a satirical way. So hopefully people find themselves at that kind of elision, like if the tectonic plates of tragedy and comedy are eliding, hopefully the reader finds themselves at that point of the rub. The Venn diagram feels a little gray. Like, is this humor or is this something a little bit more fraught? And hopefully the answer is it's both.
Well, there's a couple of aspects of confronting the patriarchy that I want to ask you about here. And so let me start with the first one, which is the whole collection feels like a real defiance of the patriarchy in a lot of ways, but done in a very wry way. There's a lot of humor, some very some subtle and some less subtle, more direct humor. Tell me a little bit about your intent around that look at this issue of the patriarchy.
Yeah. Well, the manuscript started from a really intellectual locus. I should say that my chapbook, which is a shorter poetry collection called Battledore, came out in 2017. And those poems are very much aligned to me, to my biography. I had some pretty significant postpartum depression, and just questions around identity related to early motherhood are central to those poems in Battledore. And what I wanted to do after that was not talk about myself at all. And so I wanted to embark on a project of writing poems that felt divorced from the first person, that felt more like documentary poetics. And I started by looking at Western visual art and the relative erasure of Western visual artists who identify as female, who are women or who identify as female. Where are they in the history of art? And as we're talking right now, there's a book, a nonfiction book that I haven't gotten my hands on yet, but I'm really excited to read it, by Katie Hessel, called The Story of Art Without Men. It's on the bestseller list right now. So it's something that I think people are thinking about. If talent is distributed relatively, evenly or in a bell curve, right, through our human population, where have the women artists been? And I think you can look at patriarchy so clearly in the relative absence of women artists from the Smithsonian, the National Gallery of Art, right? The numbers are very, very clear. So I was thinking about that. My daughter had given me a book called Broad Strokes, which is a kind of chapter by chapter treatment of different women artists. And a lot of them I had never heard of before. And I thought, I think what I'll do is I'll sort of go about unerasing these particular women artists insofar as I can. So a sort of ekphrastic project. Ekphrasis is this response to a piece of visual art. So in some cases, I was looking at a piece of visual art and thinking, I'm going to use this as a trigger and respond. So there's some poems that became a part of the early manuscript in response to the art of Artemisia Gentileschi, who is a Renaissance painter that not a lot of people know about, though I think she's coming kind of back into consciousness now. But her father was a disciple of Caravaggio, and she was a talented artist, but women were not allowed to be formally trained. So she was trained largely at home, and she was sexually assaulted by one of her tutors. And I always say, you can't make this stuff up. This particular tutor had been hired to train her in perspective. So his job was to teach her about the math of creating that foreshortening in a painting. And he raped her, and a trial ensued with sort of lie detector test precursors that were sort of gold ring vices that were tightened around her fingers until she would, ostensibly cough up the truth of her complicity in the matter, and so on. So it's a really dramatic episode in history and art history. And that's really where I started. So the funny story is that when the manuscript was accepted by Patricia Smith, she called me in June of 2022 to say that she was accepting the book for the Miller Williams poetry series, which is out of University of Arkansas Press. I had rearranged the manuscript, resectioned it 2 days prior, after more than 2 years of having it sectioned according to subgenres of Western art. So initially it was, if you'd opened the book to page 1, you would have been in the section called nudes. And then after that, it was self-portraits, genre and history, and then landscapes with animals wedged somewhere in there. And the manuscript was like that for a really long time. So some of the poems were ekphrastic, like the Gentileschi poems, and then some of them were just more about a series called The Daughter of Man, related to Magritte, and so on. But it took me a little while to realize, I think, in late 21, early 22, that moratorium that I had called on first person poems that were tethered to my particular biography, was really too restrictive, and that the spigot was running. I just needed to kind of cut my hands under it. And so I allowed myself back in, and I would say probably a dozen new poems sprung from that, which caused me to realize, oh, I think this kind of sectioning according to these Western art genres is not really serving, and that it's actually more of a character-based sectioning. And so the heroine's journey was born. I moved from maiden to warrior to queen to crone. And then I had to solve for this really ridiculous gap between queen and crone, which we can talk about if you want to.
Well, one of the things I admire about that, hearing that story, is I think one of the hardest things for creatives to do is to look at their work that they've spent so much time on, and especially in the modern area where you're trying to move toward publication, and that's a whole process unto itself. And to be able to acknowledge that something, maybe it isn't that it isn't even, it's not that it's not working, but it's not quite as good as it could be, or done in the way that feels right at that moment. And to have the courage to go ahead and change it, that's hard. I know we joke around about killing our darlings, in fiction writing. You may love a sentence or a paragraph or a whole chapter, but ultimately, if it doesn't serve the overall goal, sometimes it's just got to go. Maybe you save it for something else. So I admire people who have the ability to recognize that stuff in their own work and make that difficult decision. I think a lot of creative people, very, very challenged to do that. When you came to that decision, how did that work for you? Was it one of those ones where you had to fight with yourself a little bit, or was it, it seems so obvious that you felt, no, this is an easy thing to do because it's the right thing to do?
Yeah. I went to Virginia Center for Creative Arts, which is a lovely place to be to work on writing. It's basically like art camp with no programming in it. You stay, they feed you beautiful food, you meet really cool other artists, and then your day is basically yours to do with it what you will. And I have to say that I had never really quite done that. I had been to workshops and conferences that were more typical workshops. You sit around a table with whatever 10 to 16 people and hash out poems and listen to a mentor give you sound bites about this and that, and then you fly home, right? And so I had done that over the years, wedged into my teaching career and into my parenting. But in 2020, I left teaching, and I was basically now free once COVID kind of removed its fangs from the calendar. I was able to do something that took a little bit more time. So I went to VCCA in September, October of 21, and I brought with me a book on the heroine's journey and did not open it. So I knew at that point that there was a possibility that the manuscript needed to be re-schemaed. But when I got there, I thought, you sort of, they give you big bulletin boards, like wall-sized bulletin boards, where you can push pin pages of a manuscript in and look at the overall design. And I think at that point, I just wasn't sort of brave enough. I had not allowed the first person spigot to flow that I referenced yet. And so the animals, nudes, self-portraits, landscapes, etc., seemed to be serving. And then the other thing that happened in that period of time, say through the winter, December, January, February of 22, was this. That particular manuscript, as laid out that way, was a finalist in 2 other contests. And it didn't land as the winner in either one of those. But to be a finalist in poetry world is a good thing. It means that you have momentum. It means that you're close. And so I thought to myself, well, why would I touch a hair on its head? It's so close. Maybe I just need to tweak a couple things or do nothing. But I was in a space of, I think, listening to a more narrative oriented voice in my head. And this is where the workshops and the training that I have as a prose writer does come in, because I feel really consciously aware of accessibility in my poems. What is the degree to which a person who is not a poetry person can enter into a poem or a section of the book, or even wider, the whole book, and feel as though they're okay there? Because a lot of people are really afraid of poems, whether they had that high school draconian teacher who made them feel intimidated by poetry, like performing scansions on the meter or whatever. It's like a quick recipe for making somebody hate poems. And so I think when I took a look at the book after it didn't land in that second contest somewhere in the winter of 22, I thought, I think it might need something here in the way of what is its organization, because the sectioning of like nudes, animals, self-portraits felt for a time like, oh, this is really, it's grabbing people, right? Like obviously you open a book, the first section is called nudes. But then I started to realize that maybe there's something gimmicky about that. And that actually what I'm saying here is something more significant, has greater import relative to feminine experience on the whole, beyond visual art. And that the visual art schema was a really useful trigger for me as the writer, but might not serve the reader in terms of helping hold their hand through the whole thing. So I think it's got to be the case, though, for every poet that we really resist temporal organization in a manuscript. It's like maybe taught in MFAs or in workshops everywhere that just feels too kind of beginning, middle, end. It's a little too easy. It doesn't necessarily convey the intelligence of the poet across, right? So what I thought I could not do was like, okay, she's a maiden, now she's the queen, and now she's the crone, and just cycle her through a human life cycle, a developmental life cycle in that way. It felt too easy. But I listened to my kind of narrative training and I thought, no, I think maybe easy, if it is easy at all, is actually going to help people understand what the heck I'm doing here, because it's not just me. I'm not the only poetic speaker in these poems. There are first person poems that are actually personae. They're not LJ. They're not, a white, middle class, middle-aged, mid-Atlantic woman. They're somebody else. And so it does feel a little bit like, oh, who are we listening to now? And so I don't think actually that the book is easy in that way. There's lots of different tonal registers. There's lots of different personae, and there's lots of different structures on the page. When you open the book, there's a sort of variety of optical experiences. And so
Right.
it's sort of like, I realized, I think we might actually really need something easy at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and take this book apart again. And this time I was at home and I just taped the pages to, we have these doors that have glass panes. And I just put a page in each pane to see if it would section out well according to the heroine's journey. And it started to really sing. I noticed the way a prose writer would notice callbacks from early poems to poems that appeared later in the book that maybe I had not necessarily intended, but the subconscious being what it is, that kind of stuff happens. And I noticed little holes where I could really use another poem there. And I felt an immediate surge. Oh, I've got an idea. Oh, I've got an idea. And I actually couldn't turn it off. And that was when I realized, oh, no, this is going to work.
Well, I want to circle back a little bit to the patriarchy discussion we were having a minute or two ago, because you address an awful lot of subjects. They're very particular, I think, to women, but of course, one of the ones you touch on here is sexual assault. And when we're and again, I don't want to dwell necessarily just on those, but to me, that was the starkest confrontation, I guess, of the traumas of the patriarchy. We talked earlier maybe about how you were able to take a more wry look at being within that framework of a patriarchy, but these are more of the traumas of life under a patriarchal system. Maybe can you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. The poem that's called Date Rape is the first poem in the warrior section. And that poem did not exist for a really long time. And it wasn't until I think I realized, well, I have these references in the Gentileschi poems and more elliptically in the Daughter of Man series that are pointing toward sexual assault as a kind of relatively ubiquitous experience in the life of woman, but I have not treated it directly. And it's the kind of thing, it's a sort of moment at which one's own psychology and one's creative work kind of intersect. It felt like it was time for the treatment of that particular episode in artistic form. And I felt like when writing Date Rape that I was able to distill a sort of lyricism out of that relatively narrative circumstance that does upend time. It does upend a sort of understanding of, space. Date rape is obviously a very straightforward term in our contemporary usage related to, sexual assault enacted by someone familiar with the other person, usually in the context of an actual date, right? Or romantic evening that goes absolutely awry. But I also meant it in terms of what happens to one sense of time, one sense of stability, order, reason in the world. And so hopefully the way I treat it in that poem doesn't feel so much triggering for people who have also experienced sexual assault, but that it feels like a kind of ask and answer to the question of, what is the why and wherefore of this particular experience? And in fact, I think the whole book is asking that. It's asking, how is woman preyed upon externally, but then also how is internalized misogyny installed as a sort of software in the female? When does it happen? And I would say one of the most surprising things, there's a couple of poems that are mentioned most frequently to me. One of those is MILF, which comes from a later section, from the Maven section, which is a term I coined to fill that gap between queen and crone, because in the heroine's journey, she goes right from queen, from running the kingdom, to a sort of muttering pariah as a crone on the edges of the kingdom, serving no one. And I thought, well, I didn't really intend, I only wanted to deploy the heroine's journey as a schema. I didn't necessarily seek to fix it, but I thought, I can't be here and not close this gap, because that's crazy. So I came up with the term Maven. But MILF is one of the poems that's mentioned. Date rape is the other. And then bisected girl with vagina is another one. And that comes from the maiden section really early in the book, but it's almost one of the last ones that I wrote. And I think that poem is a companion to the others, because it is asking, well, how does this happen? Some of the same language is used, things that the victim in date rape does not say, because she's too addled to say them. They appear again in Bisected Girl with Vagina, which is a poem about a girl's first attempt to insert a tampon. And when I thought of writing this, I almost stopped myself from writing it. I would say all three of these poems that I'm talking about almost didn't get written. MILF, I thought, oh, wouldn't that be a hoot for some other poet to write a poem about that? And then the next day I drove by the same gas station and I thought, oh, you dummy, it's you. You've got to write that poem. Date rape, I almost didn't write. Go ahead, Rich.
I wanted to see if I can interject something here.
Yeah, please.
Your thought. Okay. I will tell you, my wife jokes all the time, I'm a bigger feminist than she is. And I don't know if that's true or not. But I will say this. When I was reading Date Rape, something really struck me. Okay. Like I read that 2 or 3 times, and then set it down and ended up reading it again. I'm 59 years old. Okay. So that should give you I grew up mostly in the 70s, early 80s, right? I was a young man in that time frame. And I often think about some of the stupid shit that used to come out of my mouth that was in my head and my group of, friends that I had throughout those years. And, it was so common for us to joke about things like that, right? We would joke, you'd make these comments about, I will not be graphic. I will just say we would make jokes about things like that, right? And not thinking about them, because none of us were bad people that would do something like that. But, you're teenage boys and you're dumb as shit and you say stupid things, right? Later on, fast forward many years, having a conversation with a woman I knew who had gone through the experience that we had joked about a lot as kids. And again, I'm trying not to be graphic here, but there was this, in this day and age, there was or I should say that day and age, there was the thing of, blank or walk. You would drive a girl out into somewhere where it was a long way from home, and then she either had sex with you or you made her walk home, right? And that's why I say I'm hesitant I hate to even say it, because we joked about stuff like that. But then I talked to somebody who had grown up in a rural area and had that happen to her. And I've never forgotten it, because I thought, my God, we used to laugh about stuff like this. And I think at that point my daughter was little and everything. And I mean, it just really hit me very hard to think, how would you ever have thought that was funny? I mean, being young is not really an excuse for ever thinking that something like that would be acceptable as a thought even. And
Right.
so when I was reading that poem, it really did. It hit me again a little bit about, wow, that I can't fathom that experience, and I can't fathom partaking in it on a man's side of it even. What could possibly be going through your head to think
Hmm.
that this is an acceptable behavior in any way, shape, or form?
Yeah.
And then what it must be like for a woman to have survived something like that. And
Yeah.
there
I mean, I
were a
think,
couple of other
what
references.
you're,
I'm sorry,
yeah.
there were a couple of other references in some of those poems too that made me think that, which is why I wanted to ask you about them. And I hope that's all not too personal stuff, but I just think that is such, because we seem to be moving in a society, as a societal way, at least in some quarters, to where we're back to a potential president of the United States
Yeah.
making light of raping somebody in a
Yeah.
goddamn, dressing room. It made
Yeah.
my skin crawl.
I
So anyway,
think,
I don't even know if I have a question there. I just wanted to let you know that as I read
no,
that,
no, I think
that
that's really
really
important.
get inside me a little bit. That was really impactful.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm proud of any time anything I write can give someone pause in any way, shape, or form. And so I think that's amazing. I think what you're talking about are acculturated norms. And I think we've moved significantly. Now, that depends on a lot of things. Lots of different endemic circumstances are fighting against that movement. But I will say this, that I don't think that I would have been able to write date rape if we hadn't had Me Too and if we didn't have Trump, because it felt like I had permission on the one hand, greater societal permission to talk about, to use as subject matter a pretty significant trauma and to stylize it in a way. I mean, I wrote it in first person, but then I decided to change it to third because I wanted to pull the punch a little bit so that the reader could have access to it without feeling like it was simply, well, there's nothing simple about it, but without feeling like it was the poet interceding into the book to confess something significant and then leaving the reader with that trauma. So hopefully the way in which that poem is arranged, and it does sound like it worked that way for you, allowed for that. I think Christine Blasey Ford and her testimony, all of these moments, these cultural moments, led me to talk about in poetic form something that occurred in my biography when I was 16. And to be able to put forth that episode in a way that felt like, well, it will be here in service of the broader poetic project, so that if these were poem paintings hanging on the wall, one would not walk into the room and only see that. And I think that's what I was worried about for a very long time. My ability to write the poem felt like, I think um, this will be an absolute sort of trauma button, and it won't be able to, the reader won't be able to kind of move through it and assimilate it in any kind of useful way. And so hopefully the way that I've written it has done that. But, you know, Bisected Girl with Vagina is another poem that seems to be really impactful to women. So when I talk about the book with my women friends, I often have them say, like, oh my gosh, the tampon poem, I couldn't believe it. It was like exactly what happened with my mother outside the bathroom door trying to tell me how to insert the tampon for the first time. And I think the reason why that poem is so important thematically is because it does provide an answer to how do we get from that moment to the moment of sexual assault. How does this happen? And what you mentioned was the training, the cultural training that boys have, sort of marinating in that kind of the talk and the normalizing of the joking, the devaluing of the female body, free will, agency, etc., which is all really grotesque and harrowing and does lead only to bad things. But how do we get there as women? Not that a woman is responsible for the there-ness of the sexual assault, because I believe that that is not the case. But what I'm trying to get at is we are trained from a very young age that like nobody touches your pee-pee and this is your body and that's theirs, and you know, you're right, this is you, and how are you feeling, and you have absolute dominion over your physical experience, especially where your kind of, you know, sex organs are concerned, until the day as a girl you're taught how to insert a tampon, and all of that goes out the window because you're told your discomfort is an inconvenience. Hurry up. It doesn't matter. You're not special. Everybody has to do this. Let me in. I will do it for you. And so all of the talk that we are exposed to as really young women, the second this rite of passage happens, there is a new ceremony there that I don't think that we talk about in society at all, which is to say, your physical self is secondary to the movement of everybody else around you. And that is why I made sure that that poem echoed with date rape. And on some level, it echoes with MILF again later in the manuscript. So all of these have, I mean, date rape doesn't, but Bisected Girl with Vagina and MILF have some humor about them. There's some level of familiar kind of a chuckle that you can get out of these poems, but then what's operating on the level underneath it?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I really wanted to ask about the profound and the deeply personal in this, which we've been talking about, but you address a lot of things here throughout these stages of life. Motherhood, attraction, resentment at times, folly at times, of course, misogyny, regret, masturbation, attraction, and then aging, and that feeling that comes with aging, which you know, I think even men can relate to, though probably in a very different way, since our value is societally in general is looked at differently still, sadly. All poetry is personal, correct? I mean, again, we've been talking about this a little bit, but it really feels, if for me as the reader, and especially someone who's not familiar with the formats, the physical formats of it all, trying to take it in and having to read it a few times and maybe understand it, how deeply personal it all is. And hearing you talk about the creative arc you've had with all of this really hammers home how deeply personal this is, which to me makes it extraordinarily valuable. I read a lot of genre fiction. That's valuable too, but there is just something that I know when I finish the book, feeling, you know, like a window into an existence that I didn't have, that I could never have. I could never have your existence or any woman's existence. So I don't know. I keep wrapping myself in a thought here without coming to a question, but I guess maybe the question is here. Is poetry always that for you, that this really deeply personal expression?
I think that I have to think about it as not that in order to approach it. I have never been a journal keeper. When I have kept journals and then looked them over later, I just find them insipid. I'm like, oh my gosh, never again. And so I do think, the poems are a more valuable chronicle of my preoccupations and philosophical musings and all of that. But there is something significant in terms of this sort of intellectual grist for the mill that's in them. Like, in other words, I don't think that I could have written any of this without having taught high school English for 14 years. There's so much in here that comes from the classroom. 14 years of teaching Shakespeare is in here in some form or fashion. I taught modern American poetry that entire time. A course called New York, New York. E.L. Doctorow's novel Ragtime is maybe my favorite or second favorite novel. I taught a course called Tough Love, which is really an epistemological course. And so thinking about how we know, what we choose to remember, the way memory actually constructs our understanding of reality, all of that is of concern to me. And so you see what I'm getting at, that if I approached the poems absolutely straight dead on as kind of like, how are you feeling today, LJ? Let's dump something, right? I don't think that I would really ever get anywhere. A lot of times I do grind an axe and it comes out in one draft. There are some poems in the book that are absolutely one drafters. Like Poetry, which is really an Ars Poetica, was a one draft poem that came out of hearing some sports, caster talk about a basketball dunk as poetry. And I thought, why does everybody always talk about everything else as poetry except poetry? And so out that poem came on a yellow legal pad in one go. But I do think you're right. I did notice when I had the book sectioned according to those Western art genres that really every landscape was a self-portrait, and every self-portrait was a landscape. All of them were nudes, right? I mean, it's all, if you're going to commit language to a page, it is a little bit different than painting, I think, because all of us traffic in language all day. And if you're suggesting that you can make art out of that exact language, you're really doing something pretty hubristic. And so hopefully there is a mechanism for unlocking the reader's emotions through doing that. And there's a lot of different attentional manipulations. That's partly what I'm doing with the structures of the poems, taking grammar and punctuation out of the poems, creating kind of modifier slippages so that we become kind of dislocated. I had a teacher named Maxine Kumin, so a great American poet in my MFA, who said in workshop once that a poem has to have geography, chronology, and furniture. And you can take one of those away, but you can't remove two. And I think, poets could quibble about this. Furniture is really just imagery. What's the stuff of the poem? Chronology is a sense of time unfolding, and geography is where are we? And sometimes you can see a poet trying to solve for that by sort of quickly throwing one of those in as the title, right? Like Robert Hass has a great poem called Meditation at Lagunitas, which is a California poem. And it's a beautiful poem. So Meditation at Lagunitas, you know where you are, even though the poem itself doesn't really have anything to do with that, but it helps ground an otherwise abstract kind of lyrical poem. So you see what I mean? Once you notice that about poems, that maybe that's what poets are doing. And so I was playing games with kind of like, how much can I take away? I tend to be very narrative. even if I try to take away chronology, I tend to tell stories with my poems. Even if I take away grammar and punctuation, even when a poem has relatively little imagery in it, it still is largely maximal. And there's just kind of nothing we can do about style. I tried for minimalism and failed.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned like a poem, because I was going to ask you about that, because before I got the book, it was funny, and I knew it was coming, and I was thinking to myself, the very thing that you talk about, because oh, you know, how we compare so many things to poetry. Oh, something was poetry in motion, or you know, and I'm a sports guy, so oh, you know, such and such was such a poetic move, or this, that, or the other thing. And then I saw, when I got to the poem, I laughed out loud. I said, this is awesome. Well, I wanted to ask so many more questions, but we talked about so many things. I'm just going to go right to the end here because we're really over time here. But I'd like to end on something that I think is meant to be a fun question. I hope it is a fun question. So certainly regular viewers have heard this one a lot. You know, I'm going to offer you three people. Let's just say I had the magical power to put you together with one of these three people to have a conversation, talk poetry, what have you, talk arts, and you can tell me which one of these three, only one, you would choose and why. And you'll get it when you hear the three that I'm going to offer you. So the three are Sylvia Plath, Renee Magritte, or Artemisia Gentileschi. Which one of those three would you pick?
And I'm talking to them about what? Anything.
You can have an evening with them to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Yeah. You know, I wrote my MFA thesis in part, well, it was on Plath and Sexton. And on the label, the word confessionalism, which is a label that neither of them made up and was basically applied to them with a kind of misogynistic baton. And so Plath, I probably would not pick, because I do feel like it would have been tremendous to have spoken to her later in her career. I think what she committed to the page is a tremendous body of work, but I would have loved to have seen what she would have done past the trauma point. Gentileschi, I think, is really interesting. Just imagining the wherewithal that it took to persevere through that particular incident. Her father tried to force her rapist to marry her in order to save her virtue, as though she was responsible for the loss of it. And it turned out the guy was already married. No one in town knew that. He had a wife in a different town. And she actually moved away and became a successful painter, doing commissions largely for the Medicis. And so that latter half of her existence, again, post-trauma, is fascinating to me. So I would have loved to have, because what happens to her is it basically disappears, and we only have record pretty much of her commissions after that. Magritte is fascinating because of the surrealist body of work. I think he's highly quotable in terms of what he said about his painting and what his intentions were, but like all great artists, what he says about his work and what he actually achieved within it might be really different things. I admire tremendously the kind of creative originality therein. So I think in talking it through, I've answered my own question that it's Gentileschi.
All right, then. Well, that's great. LJ, this has been fabulous. It's always great to talk to you anyway, but this is the first time I think we've ever really had an in-depth conversation about what it is you do. I think we've had superficial conversations about it, but not a really in-depth conversation about about your work and what poetry means to you, and these particular sets of poems and how it all came to be. I think it's always fascinating. I mean, there's several reasons I do this, but one of them is to learn how people do what they do. I always find that fascinating. So I'm going to hold the book up one more time for those of you on YouTube. So it's The Daughter of Man by L.J. Sysko. Really highly recommend this, whether you're a poetry person or not, and maybe specifically if you're not really a poetry person, because I think that review that I referenced earlier is really true. It's very accessible for. I think sometimes people don't want to access poetry because maybe they don't. It makes them not smart or something, like they're missing something.
Yeah, I think people feel underqualified.
Absolutely, and I don't. And this feels modern, certainly because of the themes. There's lots of stuff here I think people will relate to. We're not talking about 16th century thinking, right, or what have you, right? This is a very modern perspective, and just a really enjoyable thing. So I highly recommend it to anyone who thinks they might be interested in this. And I really want to thank L.J. Sysko again for coming on and sharing her insights into her work and into this particular book. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come talk. I really appreciate it, Rich. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, for those of you out there in the audience, I will say the same thing I always say, which is, please hit subscribe. Be so kind as to leave a nice review. It helps other people find the show, which is important. I do my best to get the word out there, but a good review and giving those 5 stars really does help. Plus, I also stay away from social media where I can these days, because if you've been on Twitter, you know what a cesspool that is. So I'm limiting myself a little bit. So I really am kind of counting on folks, the word of mouth. If you can tell just one person, hey, I saw this or heard this really great interview with a creative person, it's worth checking it out. Good for them, good for me, and hopefully good for you too. So end of commercial. Thank you very much. Same thing again. I always say, for myself, Rich Eisen, the open mic, my guest, L.J. Sysko, and for all of you, tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please make today count. Take care.